Okay, let's unpack this. You've brought us a deep dive into a genuinely intense and pivotal moment in history, the Disputation of Tortosa.
And calling it a disputation, well, it almost feels like an understatement for this event. It wasn't some free-flowing academic debate.
Mhm.
The material shows it was a series of mandated confrontations.
Mandated, right?
Yeah, and it dragged on for well over a year, 1413 into 1414, right there in Tortosa, which is in Catalonia, part of the Crown of Aragon then.
Exactly. The source we're looking at, this detailed account, it really hammers home that this wasn't just about arguing points. It seems it was explicitly designed, as the article puts it, to, well, force conversion on the Jews.
And act as a propaganda attack by the Christian side against Jews. That quote really sets a different tone from the start, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
And this account, it covers the background, walks us through the proceedings across, I think, 3 distinct phases, details the key arguments from both sides, and gets into the heavy long-term results.
So our mission today is to kind of navigate this complex material. We want to pull out the crucial moments, understand the surprising, sometimes frankly shocking tactics that were used, and really grasp the lasting impact of this clash.
It's a pretty stark illustration of how power dynamics shape these historical events.
Yeah, and how ancient texts themselves can be, well, wielded as weapons.
What's fascinating here is digging into not just what was argued, but how the whole setting, the rules of the debate, fundamentally skewed everything from the get-go.
Absolutely. So let's dive in and see what this deep dive reveals about this challenging period in Jewish-Christian relations in the Middle Ages.
Okay, so to set the scene for this whole incredibly long event, who actually kicked it off? What was the driving force behind gathering everyone for over a year of this?
Well, the main instigator was a man named Gerónimo de Santa Fe.
Ah,
He was a convert from Judaism to Christianity, and notably, he was the personal physician to the Antipope Benedict XIII.
the anti-pope's doctor.
Interesting.
Yeah. And after his conversion, he basically composed something for the antipope, laying out specific topics designed to, challenge his former co-religionists.
Antipope, he was receptive to this idea.
Oh, more than receptive. The material suggests he was enthusiastic. Apparently, the aging antipope was quite keen on religious debate and sort of seized this opportunity to mandate this grand disputation.
And he needed political cover too, right?
Yes, King Ferdinand I of Aragon gave his permission, so it was set in motion.
And that word mandated is really key here, isn't it? This wasn't a voluntary invitation to chat.
Not at all. Letters were sent out to various Jewish communities starting in 1413. The accounts make it clear that any attempts by Jewish leaders to kind of avoid participating were just unsuccessful. They were compelled to attend.
Which immediately puts it in a different category than some earlier disputations we might think of, like the one in Barcelona with Maimonides, maybe.
Oh, it's a critical distinction. In earlier events like Barcelona or maybe Paris, Jewish representatives had often been granted some degree of immunity or at least protection during the debate.
But not here.
Not here.
Yeah.
The conditions were fundamentally stacked against them. The account highlights that, and this is crucial. Every Jewish attempt to respond to the Christian charges was met with the threat of the accusation of heresy.
Wow. That must have just shut down any genuine debate immediately.
It transformed the event entirely. It wasn't a free theological discussion. It became what the source describes as a propaganda attack, explicitly using psychological pressure in the form of intimidation and threats.
Just imagine trying to defend your beliefs when every point you make could be twisted into a capital offense.
Exactly. The stakes were incredibly high and not in a good way.
Okay, so with the deck so heavily stacked, let's look at how the proceedings actually started. Phase 1 kicked off in February 1413. What was the initial strategy from the Christian side?
It began on February 7th. Gerónimo de Santa Fe presented the main debate points and right up front established a rule. The Jewish participants were forbidden from causing any difficulties for Christianity during the debate.
So basically, they couldn't effectively challenge the premise or the Christian faith itself?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Talk about an uneven playing field.
Unbelievable. And what was the stated motivation from the papal perspective? Why were they doing this, supposedly?
Gerónimo articulated the Pope's stated goal. He considered the Jews lost lambs, and his desire was to bring them back to God, even more so, he claimed, than, say, Muslims.
Right. And how was the debate structured day to day? Must have been grueling.
It sounds like it. They rotated the main Jewish speaker daily, which the material suggests added significantly to the stress they were under.
Constantly shifting footing.
Yeah, and the pressure was so intense that arguments apparently even broke out among the Jewish leaders privately back at their lodgings. And crucially, to maintain control, the Christian opponent was always given the last word in any exchange.
Talk about controlling the narrative. So what were the main arguments the Christians leaned on in this first phase, particularly using Jewish texts?
They heavily relied on interpretations of midrashic passages, these are rabbinic commentaries, to argue that the Messiah had already appeared.
Okay, what kind of interpretations?
Key points they brought up included interpreting texts to link the Messiah's birth to the destruction of the Second Temple, using a Talmudic statement about the world's lifespan being 6,000 years, with the final 2,000 being the Messianic age.
Implying we were already in it.
Right, and citing a Pesikta Midrash, which they interpreted to mean the Messiah would suffer, fitting their narrative of Jesus.
So, using the Jews' own traditional texts against them, how did the Jewish representatives attempt to counter these interpretations under such pressure?
Well, they tried to employ different levels of textual interpretation. They used both peshat, which is the sort of plain or surface meaning, and drash, the more comparative or homiletical interpretation.
Try to show other ways to read those passages.
Exactly, to try and reinterpret these midrashim and remove the messianic sting the Christians were imposing. They also fell back on a point famously made by nominees at the earlier Disputation of Barcelona.
Which was?
That they weren't obligated to believe in Agada, the non-legal narrative parts of the Talmud and Midrash, as matters of core binding dogma.
Interesting. How did Gerónimo respond to that claim that Agad isn't binding dogma? That seems like a solid point.
He kind of used it as a weapon. He depicted them as heretics within their own religious framework by suggesting they were rejecting parts of their own tradition.
Oof. Turning it back on them.
Yeah. The Jewish side also tried to argue that belief in the Messiah, while important, wasn't the absolute core, the indispensable mainstay of Judaism anyway.
Which foreshadows later developments, right?
Very much so. A point that Yosef Albo would later significantly expand upon in his major work, Sefer HaDekurim, written after this whole ordeal.
And there was a specific source Gerónimo used that caused a huge controversy.
Yes, he relied heavily on Midrashim, found in a book called Pugio Fidei, Dagger of Faith, by Ramon Martí, a much earlier Dominican friar.
And the Jewish side contested these.
Vehemently. They claimed these passages were fraudulent, essentially forgeries, and demanded to be shown the original Jewish manuscripts where these supposed Midrashim appeared.
Were they allowed to see the originals? Let me guess.
No, that demand was not granted. And it's worth noting, the authenticity of those specific Midrashim from Pugio Fidei is actually still a subject of scholarly debate today.
Fascinating detail. So how did this first phase conclude after about 2 weeks of this intense back and forth?
Well, the head of the Dominican order declared a Christian victory.
Surprise, surprise.
Their reasoning was that the Jews' own Midrashim, according to the Christian interpretation, proved the Messiah had already arrived. And the Jews had either failed to answer adequately or had simply, no answer at all.
And the Pope's reaction.
Following this, the Pope weighed in. He claimed the Jews were being inconsistent in their statements, perhaps changing their stories, and directed that the disputation would continue, but shift to a written format through March and April.
So a change in format, but the fundamental power imbalance and the overall tone seemed to persist.
Absolutely. When the Jewish side requested a truly free, open debate, a real discussion, they were flatly told this wasn't the purpose.
What was the stated purpose then?
The purpose was indoctrination and inculcation, specifically targeting the Jewish masses. It implies the rabbis present weren't even the primary audience for the message, but rather a conduit.
Wow.
Even a response from the Jewish side expressing humility, saying something like, mistakes and errors might befall them, but the law of Moses is forever, didn't change the relentless pressure. And Gerónimo, he just continued to use those contested Pugio Fidei Midrashim without ever producing the manuscript.
Okay, that takes us into the second phase, which began around May. What was the main topic of contention there? Did it shift?
Yeah, the debate shifted focus. It moved from whether the Messiah had come to what the Messiah was actually supposed to accomplish.
And the Jewish argument?
It was pretty clear and concrete. The Messiah must lead the nation of Israel out of the diaspora, gather the exiles, and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem.
Very specific actions that Jesus hadn't performed.
Exactly. Their arguments highlighted the undeniable realities on the ground. The diaspora continued. Christianity hadn't encompassed the whole world. Nations were still at war. There was no universal peace. and sin persisted.
Tangible stuff.
Right. And they emphasized that the concept of the redemption of Israel inherently meant the redemption of the Jews specifically, and that simply hadn't happened. They rejected the Christian idea that Gentiles could just be called Israel in some symbolic way.
How did the Christian side counter that very concrete physical definition of messianic redemption?
Well, they went back to the Midrashim again, but interpreted them differently. They argued that the redemption brought by the Messiah was primarily spiritual system, focusing on things like atonement for humanity's sins and freeing souls from hell.
A more abstract redemption. And the Jewish response to that spiritual interpretation.
Their counter was pretty direct. You don't actually need a Messiah for that kind of spiritual salvation. They argued that individuals who observe the mitzvot, the commandments, achieve salvation of their souls in the afterlife in every single generation without requiring any specific messianic intervention for that purpose.
Interesting theological point. The topic of sacrifices also came up, didn't it? That's often a point of contention.
It did. Gerónimo argued that sacrifices would be abolished in the Messianic age. He even brought up Maimonides' view on sacrifices.
The great Jewish philosopher.
Right, suggesting Maimonides saw sacrifices mainly as a kind of psychological crutch, a concession for a community transitioning away from paganism, implying they were always meant to be temporary.
And the Jewish representatives' view on sacrifices.
They maintained that sacrifices would indeed continue in the Messianic era. They argued that beyond any rational explanations like Maimonides offered, there were also deeper mystical interpretations of their purpose that weren't just about some temporary psychological need.
Okay. And finally, the very painful issue of the ongoing exile of the Jewish people. How did that play out?
This was a point the Jewish leaders contested fiercely. The Christian side pushed the claim that their continued exile was divine punishment for refusing to accept Jesus.
A common accusation.
Yes. The Jewish response pointed out the lack of logic here, or at least the inconsistency. They noted that converting to other faiths, say Islam, and turning to powerful empires like the Ottomans wouldn't have magically ended their political subjugation or freed them from bondage either.
So it wasn't just about Jesus.
They argued the cause of the exile wasn't tied specifically to accepting or rejecting Jesus, but was a much more complex matter of history and divine providence, not simply a punishment for rejecting Christianity per se.
That takes us to the third and final phase, which included a significant shift to scrutinizing the Talmud itself. But there was a break in between, wasn't there?
Yes, there was a recess, quite a long one actually, lasting from August to November 1413. The proceedings finally resumed on January 8th, 1414.
And the mood must have been even worse by then.
It seemed so. By this point, the strain was clearly immense. The sources say only 3 of the original Jewish leaders felt able to continue actively participating. Apparently, Yosef Albo even asked if he could go home, though he did remain in Tortosa.
So fewer participants, but the same intense pressure, I assume.
Absolutely. The Jewish side opened this phase by challenging the fundamental logic the Christians were using with the Midrashim all along.
How so?
They argued that even if, just for the sake of argument, you could read a Midrash to suggest a Messiah had come, it offered zero proof whatsoever that this figure arrived specifically in Jesus' time. Therefore, they asked, how could this possibly prove the truth of Christianity? The logical gap.
A fair question. How did the Christians try to pivot from that logical challenge?
Their counter was a bit slippery. They said that while they, the Christians, weren't bound to believe in the Midrashim, the Jews, who did supposedly accept them, were therefore compelled by these texts to conclude that the Messiah was already born.
Sort of. You believe this, so you must accept our conclusion from it.
Pretty much. The Jewish leaders continued to push back, trying to explain why this line of reasoning was flawed from their perspective, pointing out the selective use and interpretation.
And this is where Ashrik Halevi made that really crucial point about the definition of Messiah itself.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Ashrik Halevi interjected to highlight something fundamental. The very word Messiah carried entirely different meanings, different connotations, different expectations within Jewish and Christian theological frameworks.
So the whole debate was almost talking past each other.
He argued the real disagreement wasn't over whether a Messiah had come, but rather over what a Messiah really is. He also tried, very bravely I think, to contextualize the debate itself. He stated that if an arguer failed, it was a reflection of their own ability under duress, not some inherent failure of the faith they represented.
And he brought up the utterly unfair conditions they were facing directly, didn't he?
Precisely. He pointed directly to the desperate situation of the Jewish leaders. They were far from their homes, probably suffering property losses, their families potentially facing harm or pressure. He argued that their degraded circumstances, their fear, made debating them unfairly easy.
That the outcome couldn't be seen as a true measure of the validity of their faith because of the coercion involved.
Exactly. A very human plea, really.
How did Geronimo respond to that, to the point about duress?
Geronimo just dismissed it, and he actually used their visible distress against them. He claimed their scared and frightened demeanors demonstrated that their belief wasn't true.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, he cited Psalm 119, verse 46, which speaking of God's testimonies before kings and not being ashamed, implying that true faith would make them bold and unafraid, not scared.
So, blaming the victim for being afraid in a terrifying situation.
Essentially. He insisted the disputation was necessary and demanded that the Jewish leaders account for the very Torah they taught. And then Zerachiah Halevi added another important theological counter here.
What was that?
He emphasized that belief in the Messiah is a core principle of faith within Judaism. And according to Jewish thought, the Midrashim, these rabbinic texts, should be interpreted through the lens of these established principles. You don't use a midrash to argue against a fundamental principle.
So the principle governs the interpretation, not the other way around. That makes sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this back and forth over the Messiah, it continued until April 1414. Then Geronimo delivered a summary of the whole disputation from his perspective, effectively closing that line of discussion.
And then the focus shifted dramatically, didn't it? To something incredibly significant and often targeted throughout Jewish history.
Yes. The debate turned squarely to the Talmud. This directly echoed the earlier disputation of Paris in 1240, with accusations flying that the Talmud contained errors, heresies, defilements, and blasphemies against the Christian religion.
A familiar charge. How did the remaining Jewish representatives handle this new line of attack, especially after everything they'd already endured?
At this point, most of them made a very difficult strategic decision. They opted to remain silent on this topic.
Just refused to engage.
They essentially stated that while they were certain the ancient sages who composed the Talmud would know how to defend their own work, they themselves felt they lacked the necessary expertise or perhaps the strength under the circumstances to mount an adequate defense against these broad accusations.
Understandable given the context. Did anyone speak up at all?
Yosef Albo and Zerachiah Halevi reportedly did not join the collective silence and agreed to respond. However, frustratingly for historians, their specific responses to the charges against the Talmud are not recorded or known. We don't have a text of what they said.
That's a real loss. And what was the ultimate devastating demand Geronimo made regarding the Talmud at this stage?
He demanded its complete burning. Full stop.
Wow.
He even cited the earlier internal Jewish controversy over Maimonides' philosophical works, which had tragically resulted in some of his books being burned by other Jews, as a kind of precedent. His argument was twisted. If even a part of a book is deemed heretical or offensive, the entire book should be destroyed.
A truly chilling demand, using an internal conflict for external leverage. How did this whole grueling event finally conclude? It just petered out.
It appears the remaining Jewish leaders collectively decided the immense cost, the ongoing harm being done to their communities and families back home by their enforced absence, and the relentless pressure was simply too high. They concluded they needed to end it basically at all costs. The disputation formally concluded in December 1414, over a year and a half after it began.
So after all that time, all that pressure, what were the tangible results and what was the longer-term legacy of the Disputation of Tortosa?
Well, the Antipope Benedict XIII, predictably, declared a Christian victory. Following the disputation, he issued instructions that all copies of the Talmud should be handed over to his officials for censorship or possible destruction.
So action was taken against the Talmud.
Yes. Compulsory conversions of Jews also continued in the wider region, although the material suggests this wasn't necessarily a direct official outcome mandated by the disputation itself, but it certainly contributed to the hostile climate that encouraged them.
Was there any avenue for those who were forced to convert during this period? Could they go back?
Yes, interestingly, the material mentions that Jews who were coerced into converting to Christianity did apparently have a legal pathway, at least for a time, to return to Judaism if they wished. It wasn't necessarily a permanent, irreversible step legally, initially.
And the pressure on Jewish communities didn't just stop when the disputation ended, did it?
No, it definitely continued. You had figures like Vincent Ferrer, who became quite famous or infamous for traveling through communities, compelling Jews to attend his sermons, pushing his conversion campaign northward into France as well. The pressure was ongoing.
However, there was a political shift later that brought some relief.
Right. In 1416, so just a couple of years later, King Alfonso V ascended the throne in Aragon. And he seems to have taken steps to reverse some of the harsh anti-Jewish legislation that had been enacted during that Ferrer-influenced period.
So some top-down protection returned.
The account indicates he actively protected both Jews and conversos, the converts, from the beginning of his reign, and apparently rejected further attacks or pressure campaigns against them.
But even with that later protective shift at the top, the impact of the disputation itself, psychologically and socially, must have been deeply damaging.
Oh, absolutely. The material really emphasizes that the main damage was to morale. It was described as a hard blow to the Jewish communities in Aragon.
And conversions did happen.
Yes, many prominent individuals, including dignitaries and wealthy families, did convert in the aftermath. The general feeling, it seems, was that the Jewish side had been decisively defeated, that they had gotten the worst of it in the confrontations with Geronimo.
I remember reading there was even later criticism from within the Jewish community about the arguments made.
Yes, figures like the later commentator Isaac Abravanel criticized the perceived weakness of the theological arguments presented by the Jewish leaders at Tortosa. But, and this is crucial to remember, as our source points out, they were operating under extreme duress.
Right.
Their ability to respond effectively, to succeed in debate terms, was severely limited by the hostile conditions and the constant threat of heresy charges.
And one of the significant intellectual legacies that emerged directly from dealing with this pressure, you mentioned it earlier.
That would definitely be Yosef Albo's major philosophical work, Si Sefer HaHakim, the Book of Fundamental Principles. It was written after the disputation, and it directly addresses one of the key debate points.
Which one?
It explicitly expands on and defends the idea that belief in the Messiah, while certainly important, was not the single indispensable mainstay or absolute core principle of Judaism, perhaps pushing back against the Christian attempt to make it the sole litmus test.
And that chilling demand to burn the Talmud, while maybe not immediately carried out everywhere instantly, it did lead to a concrete damaging action at the highest level, didn't it?
It absolutely did. A papal bull was issued by Benedict XIII in May 1415, shortly after he declared his victory at Tortosa. And this bull explicitly forbade the study of the Talmud. That was a significant official blow to Jewish intellectual and religious life.
So bringing this all together then, what does this deep dive into the Disputation of Tortosa ultimately tell us? What's the big picture takeaway?
I think it tells us this wasn't just some historical debate about theology, abstract points. It was a raw, prolonged exercise in power, in coercion, using religious texts as leverage. And it marked a deeply challenging, traumatic turning point for the Jewish communities of Aragon.
Yeah, the disputation really stands out, doesn't it? Because of its sheer length, its completely forced nature, and the overwhelming pressure put on the Jewish representatives. And that specific outcome you mentioned, the demand to burn the Talmud, followed by the actual papal bull forbidding its study, it really highlights the true goal wasn't persuasion, was it? It was suppression.
Exactly. It's a stark reminder of how events driven by such unequal power dynamics can inflict devastating damage on communities' crushing morale, forcing people into impossible situations like conversion, even if some technical legal loopholes, like the option to revert to Judaism, technically existed for a brief time.
If we zoom out a bit, it feels like a powerful historical case study showing how the interpretation of sacred texts can be, well, weaponized, not just for understanding or spiritual guidance, but for asserting dominance and challenging core beliefs under direct threat.
And what really stands out, I think, is observing the different strategies the Jewish participants attempted under that intense duress. You see everything from careful textual counter-arguments to raising fundamental challenges about the Christian premises, and ultimately even pointing out the sheer unfairness of the conditions themselves. They tried different angles.
Which really leads to an important question for you listening to consider. When religious belief is essentially put on trial under such overwhelming pressure and such extreme inequality, does the outcome of that confrontation truly reflect the inherent validity of the faith being challenged? Or is it primarily, maybe even entirely, a reflection of the power dynamics at play and the profound vulnerability of the people forced into that situation?
We've navigated the sources you provided on the Disputation of Tortosa. It's definitely a difficult but really significant piece of history to grapple with. Hopefully this deep dive gives you a clearer picture and some compelling insights into this challenging event.
Absolutely. It's a lot to take in, for sure. But understanding these moments, however uncomfortable, is key to understanding the broader sweep of history. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.